Welcome, everyone. Please take your seats. We'll get the program underway. So welcome, everyone. Welcome to the what we think is the 13th Annual Energy Summit. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm Gates Brailsford, the co-chair of the Energy Summit Subcommittee, and longtime committee member and friend Ernie LaFleur joined me as co-chair. But before Claude starts, I want to just name the guys that are on the amazing Energy Summit team that make all this happen. Claude Figueroa with CenterPoint, just stand and wave or whatever you want to do. Ernie LaFleur, board member of several energy companies and geoscience societies. Brent Jasper Ventures. Ben Morgan, Lockton Companies. Greg Jean, VME, he's not here today, unfortunately. Roy Maynard with Life Powered. Scott Baker with Infinity Project Management. Brad Stinson with VME, wherever Brad is, there he is. Hunter Carr Resources, and Tom Trimble with Encore. And of course, our fearless leader, wherever he is, Henry Bell. We got to give him a hand. So thank you, guys. Our mission with this event and what we do at the Energy Summit is to basically spread informed understanding of key energy issues that impact all of us. That's our families, our jobs, our community, and really our civilization. Life as we know it, basically. Everything depends on affordable and available energy. So each year, we try to select the themes that seem critical, that are current and critical to the industry. That said, we do have some amazing speakers today, very well qualified speakers, and we look forward to a very interesting program today. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
And good morning, everyone. I'm Claude Figueroa, and I'm with CenterPoint Energy, and I'd first like to thank my employer for giving me the time to not just be here, but also to be the chair of the full Energy Committee. It's my distinct pleasure to serve the Chamber of Commerce in this capacity, and it's really good to see the turnout here today, and I thank each one of you for being here and supporting science-based information and facts related to energy. I'd like to take time now to thank our sponsors. We would not be able to put on these programs without the help of our sponsors and their support. So I'd like to recognize our presenting sponsor, Lockton Companies, and then our platinum sponsors are Delek Refining, Mewbourne Oil, and the Genicove Group. Our gold sponsors are Clemens Fluid, Golub Morgan Petty, Henry and Peters, Jasper Ventures, and Ridge Wireline. The full list of sponsors is located in the card at your table. So if you would please just glance at those, and if you see some of the representatives from these companies, please extend your thanks as well. At this time, I'd like to recognize our elected officials. And present with us today, we have from the 12th Court of Appeals, Chief Justice James Worthen. Oh, we have a fan out there. We have from U.S. Congressman Nathaniel Moran's office, Chelsea Cohen. From the City of Tyler, Mayor Don Warren. And from the City of Tyler City Council, we have Councilman Broderick McGee, Councilman James Wynn, Councilman Brad Curtis, Councilman Shirley McKellar, and Councilman Stuart Hain. Visiting with us from the City of Bullard, we have City Councilman Lane McDaniel. And visiting from the City of White House, City Councilman Zach Briscoe. From Smith County, we have Smith County Judge Neil Franklin. And we have Smith County Commissioners Pam Frederick, John Moore, Ralph Caraway, and Commissioner Terry Phillips. Present with us today also, we have County Court at Law 2, Judge Sarah Maynard. And then we have also Tyler Junior College Board of Trustees being represented by Lonnie Uzel. A round of applause to our elected officials, please. Ernie LaFleur and Brent Jasper organized some student volunteers to be with us today. And Stephen F. Austin provided some volunteer students, and I believe they're in the engineering field, and so they are the future of energy and committees like this. So if you would please, the Stephen F. Austin volunteer students, would you please stand and be recognized? We appreciate you very much. At this time, I'd like to introduce Ben Morgan, who is going to mention or introduce our VIP. And he is an elected official, but I shouldn't have let him out, but we'll let Ben introduce him. A man that needs no introduction. Thank you.
Claude, thank you for the introduction. And Gates, I can confirm this is our 13th year, although sometimes I think it feels like our 20th, but it is only our 13th year. And we appreciate everybody coming out this year. It has grown significantly from, I remember back in the days when I was first attending this, wasn't on the subcommittee. It was, I think we had 75 to 100 people, and we were over at the Ornalis Center at UT Tyler. It has significantly grown and continues to grow each year as we bring in more talented, more knowledgeable, and more well-represented speakers here. And one guy who is certainly not new to East Texas and is certainly not new to the Texas oil and gas scene or to this conference. He's been here several times before, and it's always my honor and pleasure to get to introduce a good friend of mine, Wayne Christian. Wayne's been a lifelong conservative businessman who grew up in Tenaha, Texas. Wayne was reelected for his second term as our 50th railroad commissioner last November. And for those of y'all, I learned this years ago because I had no idea. The Railroad Commission in Texas does not have squat to do with the railroad anymore. So for those of you scratching your head going, why the hell is this guy here? That's the reason. Throughout his first term, Wayne developed a strong record of fighting against frivolous regulations and standing for our free markets and American energy dominance. Commissioner Christian was appointed by Governor Greg Abbott to the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission as an official representative of Texas. Through this role, Christian has been a national leader on the forefront of fighting the Biden administration's efforts such as the Green New Deal and other agendas. Christian is a East Texas native and a graduate of Stephen F. Austin University, which we have some students here today representing there, and probably a few graduates out there. After college, Wayne found success in the music industry with the country gospel band, the Mercy River Boys, and went on to be a finalist for a Grammy in 1979. After gaining valuable experience in business, banking, and real estate, Wayne opened the financial services business that he still owns to this day. He is a 3-time AIG top advisor nationwide. Prior to his time on the commission, Christian served 7 sessions in the Texas House of Representatives as the first Republican in Deep East Texas since the Reconstruction after the Civil War. He was a leader for the conservative renaissance in our state and successfully assisted in the fight to elect a Republican majority in the Texas legislature. You guys, give it a hand for our Texas Railroad Commissioner, Wayne Christian.
Well, as the only Christian in statewide government, I've been asked to do the invocation to start us off this morning, okay? So since they know I got a relationship by the name, they asked me to do this. So if you would, please bow your head. Let me first, let me just say this. I heard a story pretty quick because, us politicians have to overdo a little bit. There was this guy that was a drunk, a thief, and somewhat of a scoundrel that wound up in heaven. And, the admission committee of angels and all kind of got around, and St. Peter couldn't find his name in the book. And they got to looking and went to the guy and said, hey, you were cussing the Lord yesterday. You were drinking. You were stealing stuff. You're a thief. How'd you get in? And they started asking the guy. He said, I don't know. And so they kept asking him, said, well, did you go into a church sometime and accidentally talk to the preacher and get, somebody say, well, no, I don't think so. Did you go to a priest somewhere and just accidentally told your story to him? And they said, no, I don't think so. And he said, well, this isn't making sense. How'd you get in this thing? Let's call the executive angel and get him to come down and interview this guy. And so they got to interviewing him, and they came and said, well, are you aware of the road, the plan of salvation? And the guy said, never heard it. Well, he said, well, is there any reason you can think that you made it here? And said, well, all I know is there were three of us hanging on crosses, and the guy in the middle said he would let me in. Let us turn to that middle man on the cross this morning. Father, we come to you today just thanking you for all you've done, for allowing us this land, this freedom, these minerals, that you've adored Texas, given Texas the largest amount that saved us in World War I, World War II, and again for the third time in a century have given us the largest amount of minerals anywhere almost on planet Earth. Help us to be the good stewards that we should be with your gift to mankind. Thank you for this food. Thank you for this meeting. Keep us safe. In your name we pray. Amen. Okay, now I'm doing the political part of the show. So Ben told me to sit down and shut up, and I've got my timer, and it says start, and it's going to whine when I get over time. We have been blessed, and I want to report to you from Austin. I see Texas Oil and Gas Association has a representative here today, and Todd Staples is a great friend and has done a lot of good East Texas man doing a good job there with oil and gas. But the legislature this session, I believe, is really a group of heroes from across the state. They're doing a tremendous job. I visited with Lieutenant Governor Patrick about 3 weeks ago. He came out with a press conference just a few days back with some of our good friends that serve with me in the Texas House, Phil King, and he announced a group of bills to help preserve Texas oil and gas, including stopping all preferential treatment to unreliable wind, solar, and other things, making a level playing field in Texas for the industries. Understand the last 20 years, Texas federal and state dollars, according to the Texas Public Policy Foundation, almost 90 billion Texas federal and state dollars have gone to support wind and solar. I talked to Governor Rick Perry, and Governor Perry said, Christian, I was in there when we started that stuff. We never thought it'd get over 15%. And Rick, with a few adjectives, says, they've gone crazy the last 7 or 8 years with that stuff. Think of this, folks. Since Storm Uri, wind and solar went to 0 and 5% electrical generation. Natural gas, 99% of the folks that turned on a valve during Storm Uri for natural gas got it. Natural gas saved Texas. So I did an article in Wall Street Journal published, and it said a month after Uri, what happened is we've spent so much money in Texas on unreliable energy, we let the pilot light go out on reliable energy. That's what happened. Then we had almost a rolling blackout potential this past summer, if you remember, from heat. Wind and solar went to 0 and 5%. Natural gas went to 88%. And yet, ladies and gentlemen, the last 20 years, the last 2 years since Uri, those last 2 years, we have built more wind and solar in Texas, we have retired gas and coal. Now, get this logic here where we're headed in Texas. We've increased demand to the tune of 1,000 people a day legally, most from California and Florida. I mean, California and New York, not Florida, New York. So there's more demand, and we've lowered reliable supply. This is not a formula for good in the future. And that's where we've headed. So I think we've got to awaken our society to understand what's the truth of this and what direction we go. And you look at an example, Europe, and you can see what's happened in Germany and France and these other countries that got totally dependent upon Vladimir Putin and his natural gas, and then Biden or somebody blew up the pipeline, and all of a sudden they're sitting here relying on about a 20-year period. They've been retiring coal and nuclear and gas and building more wind and solar, and now they're dependent. And literally people on CBS Sunday Morning, it said people would die if we had an average winter in Germany this coming year because they don't have heat. And towns over there were literally cutting firewood and chips from those to distribute to their citizens so they'd have something to prevent freezing to death during the winter. It's kind of crazy, isn't it? 100 years ago here in East Texas, 85% of our population was in agriculture. Daylight to dark 6 days a week. Only 15% didn't have to farm to make a living. My dad and his 3 brothers were a part of that. Average lifespan was about 45 years of age. Here in Texas, you had diseases such as the 3 environmental deaths were hurricanes, starvation, and freezing. Let's move ahead to today. Today, there are cures for diseases that there were no cures for 100 years ago. The average lifespan, instead of 45 years back then, is now about 75 today. We no longer starve to death. We have an obesity problem. We no longer freeze to death. We gripe because the thermostat's a degree or two too hot or too cold. And yet, what has been the difference in those 2 worlds? Let me tell you. Oil, gas, and coal. You hear the Paris Accord, all these folks keep telling us, oh, we're going to increase the degree up to 2 degrees. Now, what they don't tell you, that's over a 100-year period. We've already seen the past 100 years an increase in temperature in our world of 1.5 of those 2 degrees. We survived, okay? In fact, we had 99% less environmental deaths the last 100 years. Now, hold it. We went up 1.5 degrees, and now all of a sudden, we're going to have a 0.5 degree in about 20 or 30 years, and it's going to destroy the planet. It's this catastrophic situation that we've got to prevent from. It's this existential threat to humanity we keep hearing about. How do we survive the 100 years and 1.5 degrees going up? By defenses: oil, gas, and coal. We had heaters, air conditioners, transportation like nobody ever had. And yet going forward, we're going to attack 0.5 degree, and it's going to destroy the world. So we've got to get rid of the very defense mechanism that we've had the last 100 years to make our lives better. The insanity of lack of knowledge. And I think the problem I see in the state of Texas is we have good warriors. One of the top is Brian Hughes from here in Tyler. Brian I served with in the legislature over a decade. Great friend, great gentleman. He's a lot smarter than he looks. You can tell him I said that. But Brian has led out in a lot of fighting this environmental, social, and governance funds. And long story short, environmental, social, and governance funds are a fallacy, a falsehood. They're moving toward what they call stakeholder capitalism over shareholder capitalism in America. And there's no banker and financial guy kind of look at that stuff. And what has happened by fact, the last 5 years, these ESG funds have decreased funding available to oil and gas by 90% in America. Digest that. Folks, my fear is we're not winning this war at the current time. We have our population in Texas. That week before last, a poll from University of Houston came out and said 62% of Texans think the way to defeat these problems of rolling blackouts and energy shortages is build more wind and solar. We have let our education system by a bunch of old Vietnam draft dodging tenured professors teach our kids that there is a terrible thing oil and gas has done to the world, that this nation was created by a bunch of bigots, and we see division and the Marxism as fast as we can in our media and our government that decides everybody's got their group. There's a lot of things going wrong. But I'm glad to say during this session we've seen some progress, but let me tell you the issue that concerns me. And I'm supposed to report kind of what concerns me today, and it's the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act. When Al Gore comes out at the time that bill was signed and says, we have dreamed and worked for 40 years for this day, we have won. Folks, there's something very sinister in that analogy coming from Al Gore. And when you look at $372 billion with a B on it dollars that our Congress is sending us over the next 4 years to destroy oil and gas, I see no real red flags coming up. I wish I had the answer how we to defend, but where's the think tanks? Where are we even concerned about it? There was nothing about defending oil and gas in the Republican platform this year. There was nothing on the top 10 items by the governor, lieutenant governor, speaker. Nobody had defending oil and gas. Now they defend electricity, but understand electricity generation from the Railroad Commission of Texas from natural gas is only 11% of natural gas that is produced by the state of Texas. Got it? That's electricity, and that's what they legitimately are fighting in the session. Kudos to them for doing it. They're doing the right thing, trying to get us off reliable onto reliable energy again. But that's only 11% of natural gas. What about the other 89% of gas and 100% of oil, which ain't just gasoline prices? Let me clarify this. Oil is 6,000 consumer products, medicines, plastics, asphalt, 6,000 consumer products, and all of their delivery comes from oil, gas, and coal, from oil. So this is a significant threat. So here they're coming. What's going to happen, what concerns me is what always is a fight in government is who gets the money. If you're for it, you want the money. If you're against it, you want the money, right? That's how government does. If we want it, we're going to fund it. If we don't want it, we're not going to fund it. Or we'll fund the enemy. So we got $372 billion coming at Texas and America, the whole United States. Right now, the largest solar farm ever projected is being built north of Dallas, Texas. I hear there's a hydrogen refinery that's being reformed from an oil and gas refinery down in Beaumont. All this is great if the public sector was doing it, but it's not. It's part of the infrastructure bill and soon to be the Inflation Reduction Act that's going to be funding all this. And every time you expand, just like people are saying since Uri we've done, and how we had the problem of becoming dependent on unreliable energy is what caused Uri. And yet we continue in Texas down that road, and now we got $372 billion. What mayor of any town, with all due respect, what representative, what state rep, what senator is going to not come to Tyler, Texas when a $500 million solar facility is being built right outside of town with X number of new jobs for the community? They're buying our destruction with our own tax dollar, and that's the threat I see coming. And I don't see any real threat. Let me give you another example of that. I was at the State of the State address, and Governor Abbott did a great job, but not one mention of defending oil and gas in Texas. Not one mention. Then the Democratic rebuttal, I know this is not partisan, but the Democratic rebuttal had a slide come up and an oil derrick there, and the quote was, we need to defend oil and gas in the state of Texas and those hard-working workers in the oil patch. And I'm sitting this as a lifelong Republican thinking I'm in the twilight zone. What's the other side doing here? Well, this shows it's not a partisan issue at all. It's what's good for the state of Texas. Again, I go back to 1/3 of our economy, 1 of 10 jobs, all the rainy day fund, all the permanent school fund, all the higher education fund, all the lower education fund, and 1/3 of this overage we're spending right now, $33 billion in Austin. That's oil and gas. And we have $372 billion coming to shut it down. I think that's a threat we need to be aware of. Somebody better help. Do I have the answers? No. In fact, one thing that I've asked for this time in the budget at the Railroad Commission, and it was passed in the Senate, I've asked for a budget for the Railroad Commission to have a publicity, public relations, and education fund so that we can develop consistent messaging across the state of Texas of the benefits of oil and gas that people like Alex Epstein, if you haven't read his book, and others, the CO2 Coalition, which our good friend is going to be speaking today here for the CO2 Coalition, and others have developed tremendous messaging, tremendous truths that we must start giving our citizens, our kids, and the future. If not, folks, we're sitting here, and I always get this, people say, I've had people that are on corporate boards of oil and gas companies in Texas. Wayne, we've lost that argument. The shareholders have bid off into all this Green New Deal stuff, and they believe oil and gas is terrible, and we've got to do the right thing, and whatever our shareholders ask, we have to do. Whoa, I've been a financial guy for about 50 years now, and there's this fiduciary responsibility for boards of directors and corporate leaders that if you don't tell the whole truth to your shareholders, there's a kind of risk you have that of not doing the fiduciary what we're supposed to do. And when they tell me, well, we can't win this, there's no winning, there's no way, they've already been sold, I'm reminded, I talked to some other folks and I repeat myself regularly, but old quote from General Patton in World War II, if we only fought the battles we knew we could win, we'd still be under British control, right? Folks, we have a job to do, and we've been given the opportunity in Texas. World War I, I always look at that, we've got a letter from the European Commonwealth that says, thank you for the wave of oil that came from the field up, Ranger Field up in Eastland County to help win World War I. World War II, I've got a poster, Winston Churchill. It quotes, it said 80% of the oil, Big Inch and Little Inch pipeline came from Kilgore, Texas to win World War II. 80%. And Winston Churchill has a quote, he says, it was a sea of oil from East Texas that helped win World War II. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been given, in Permian Basin alone, is 200 years of energy for the United States of America. Digest that. Under current technology, 200 years. Let me tell you, just as an old politician and financial guy, if we have 200 years of reliable energy sitting here available to us, why should your tax dollar or mine be spent $1 on alternative energy resources? Why? Now, I'm all for the free market. Get after it. If you want to make water into wine, if you want to make water into gasoline, get after it. That's what wildcatters did with oil and gas. That's what many of you still do with oil and gas. You risk everything you have, go out there and buy it. You think you're going to get it, and you risk your money to do it. And when you win, guess what? Other people win. The pie gets bigger because you hire people, you expand your business. The nation benefits, the state benefits. That means the pie gets bigger and bigger. Well, we've reached this part in society that all of a sudden, whenever we look, well, we become a victim nation. And we become the point that we say, well, that pie's big. My group didn't get my share of it. I want my part of the pie. I want my part of the pie. I want my part of the pie. And the pie starts shrinking instead of expanding because people like you in this room are no longer leading the direction we're going as a country. Now, I'm not up here with the answer for today of how you fix all this. There's my clock. I'm not here with the answers to do it. But let me give you another one of these analogies, and I shared this a while ago, and I think it's great. John Quincy Adams was the only president that ever served as president of these United States that when he retired, he ran for Congress. Glutton for punishment, okay? He ran for Congress, and every Tuesday was make a motion today in Washington, every Tuesday. So he'd get up, and he would say, I move that we abolish slavery in the United States. And they would just say, oh, Lord, here comes John Quincy again, every Tuesday. Regardless, John Quincy Adams would be up there at the microphone, I move we abolish slavery. Cartoons were written of him making fun of the old crazy president, up there making a motion that he knew wouldn't pass. And when the press came to him and said, Mr. President, why do you let yourself be made such a fool of? Well, then he answered to them, he said, the work is ours, the results are God's. Think of that. Well, as Paul Harvey said the rest of the story, there was this young congressman that came for one term in Washington, 1 term, 2 years. Got elected, came in, and was just enamored with John Quincy Adams, spent a lot of time with him, and John Quincy mentored him tremendously, and he left in 2 years. And the family was so close to this young congressman that he became a pallbearer when John Quincy eventually passed away. But then another few years went by, and there was this new party, political party that developed in the United States called the Republican Party. And they nominated that young congressman as their first presidential candidate. And a few years later, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Ladies and gentlemen, we know what's right. We know what's true. We know what our kids need to hear, and we don't need to lie. I have never met a human being in all of my years in government that says, I want to destroy the environment and make sure everything's dirtier for our kids and grandkids. Never. And yet you listen to the media, you'd think that's exactly what we're in business to do. It's time we became the East Texans, became independent, became strong, believed that we have a God that's on our side, and we may not see the end. I'm old and gray-haired. I probably won't see the end of this argument. But folks, that's not my responsibility to know what the result's going to be. Your and my responsibility is to fight the fight. Thank you for being here today to do that, and thank you for this group that's organized an event exactly for that purpose. God bless.
Hi, I'm Roy Maynard with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Our next speakers I met up in Rhode Island. We went up to take a look at their story, find out more about them. Megan Lapp and Bonnie Brady didn't intend to become experts in offshore wind energy. They just saw a threat to their industry. And over time, they have become those experts, and they're very informed. They're very persuasive. I think you're really going to enjoy their presentation. So please help me welcome Megan and Bonnie.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much for having me. And I couldn't have had a better introduction than the previous speaker. As far as offshore wind, you folks aren't probably very familiar with that, but it is coming to a coastline near you. Bonnie and I have been fighting offshore wind off of the coast of New England and the Mid-Atlantic for a lot of years now. And we are now at the point where our only alternative has been to sue the federal government. And so the Texas Public Policy Foundation is taking a lawsuit for us against the federal government, against the nation's first offshore wind farm in federal waters. And, you know, I will say, before I get into the presentation, the only way to win is to refuse to lose. We have fought this for years. We get knocked down, we come back. We get knocked down, we come back, because your only option is winning. And I think that that's something that's really important, that was pointed out by the previous speaker. And so we're going to take this to the courts. We have a court date in April. And if we need to appeal, we'll appeal. We'll go all the way to the Supreme Court. And kind of as Roy said, Bonnie and I we're nobodies. But what we have discovered on this, along this fight, we're fighting foreign government-owned corporations. We're fighting billions of dollars. We're fighting federal government agendas, and we've done this through multiple administrations. And I think what's very, very important for the folks here today to know is what is actually happening in the Atlantic, because we're the guinea pigs and the Gulf is next. So if you can go to the presentation, please. This is a chart of the East Coast. On the left side, you can see all the leases that are currently leased. There are 2.3 million acres of the Atlantic that are leased right now for windmills. They want one windmill every square mile. On the other side, those are central Atlantic call areas. They range from about Cape May, New Jersey to Hatteras, North Carolina. That's another 1.7 million acres that the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management plans to lease at the end of this year. And they are not stopping there. There are Pacific leases. There are also leases in the Gulf. We're in the commercial fishing industry. So we're coming at this from the perspective of our vessels cannot operate in an offshore wind farm. It will be impossible for them operationally speaking, and we'll go a little bit more into that, but the gear that we use cannot operate in a wind farm. It'd be very, very dangerous for the vessels. These wind leases are being put on some of our most productive fishing grounds. Our boats at the company that I work for, Seafreeze in Rhode Island, we have 2 land-based facilities and 5 commercial fishing vessels, and we also unload various other independently owned vessels. And one of the primary species that we fish for is squid, which you folks will know is calamari. That's where food comes from. And a lot of this area is where food comes from. And that's a real big concern. Next slide, please. One of the issues that's also a problem for our vessels is radar interference. Offshore wind farms cause marine vessel radar interference. They cause all kinds of radar interference, defense radar interference, Coast Guard radar interference, air terminal radar interference. Every kind of radar will actually create false targets when the blades are spinning. And this has been a huge issue. It's been somewhat of an issue on land. It's more of an issue at sea, as we'll go through. But basically, the only way that a vessel can navigate in the dark, in the fog, or in inclement weather is radar. That's your eyes. And if you don't have accurate radar, you're in a life-threatening situation. In 2009, I believe it was, the Coast Guard did a report on the proposed Cape Wind project at that time, and they conducted a modeling interference study that showed that this was really a problem. Up on the top, you can see pictures of actual radar interference on real radars from commercial fishing vessels transiting next to the Block Island wind farm. Off of the coast of Rhode Island is an island called Block Island. There are 5 turbines, offshore turbines there in state waters. So you can see on a lot of those screens, there's a lot of sections where there's more than 5. And so if you're in the middle of thousands of square miles of a turbine in every direction, one turbine every square mile, your whole radar screen is going to be full of clutter, and you're not going to know what's a real target or what's not a real target. And that's an extremely hazardous situation. All the way on the right, you can see a picture of an actual radar screen in a wind farm in the UK. And in 2019, I believe it was, I submitted a lot of this information to the United States Coast Guard. And I said, look, this is a problem. You're in charge of maritime safety. You guys need to do a study here, and you need to see what the impacts are going to be. The Coast Guard's response, even though they had conducted a study in 2009, was, we're not aware of any studies that confirm or deny radar interference as a result of offshore wind turbines. Conveniently, the Coast Guard personnel in charge of that study, before the study was completed, went to work for an offshore wind company with leases in the region. In 2022, the National Academy of Sciences came out with a study where they actually quoted some of my comment submissions to the United States Coast Guard and confirmed every single issue that we had raised for years. But unfortunately, that study came out in 2022, and the first federal wind farm in offshore and federal waters was approved in 2021. So now we're left with, hey guys, good luck. There are no solutions at this time. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management said to the developer, well, it's okay. You guys can conduct your own radar interference study later and then see if you can find out some solutions. And, if you can find out some solutions, we'll discuss it with the Coast Guard, and then maybe, we can do something later, after the fact, after it's constructed, after people's lives at sea are in danger. And quite frankly, that's unacceptable, and that's one of the points that we are litigating on. Next slide, please. In 2019, one of my state senators sent a letter to the Coast Guard, and they asked, has the Coast Guard analyzed any of the radar interference on its own operations? Because the Coast Guard's got the same radar as us. The Coast Guard conducts search and rescue. We need the Coast Guard. They're also a part of the Department of Homeland Security. And the answer was no. All radar analysis is left up to the offshore wind developer, and we have not conducted any studies on the impact to our own operations or search and rescue capabilities. So what we're talking about is potential maritime disaster, but nobody's looking at it. Next slide, please. This is a chart that the United States Navy put online in 2018. This was created to show conflicts with DoD missions. The red areas are wind exclusion zones because, as I said previously, not only the height of the turbines, offshore turbines are much higher than what you folks have probably seen on land. We're talking 800 to 1,000 feet tall. And they interfere with flight missions. They also interfere with radar issues, different things. So the Navy put this up there, and they said, okay, the red areas are wind exclusion zones. But there's an awful lot of offshore wind leases in the wind exclusion zones. And so we started asking, well, how can you have the wind farm sited in the wind exclusion zones for the Department of Defense? And after we started asking those questions, the Navy changed its website and put a little disclaimer on there. Just because this says wind exclusion zone doesn't mean that you can't have a wind farm in it. So you figure that out. Next slide, please. One of the main radars that it interferes with are ARSR-4 radars. They're long-range air surveillance radars. They look out to sea for about 250 miles. And so what you're looking for is incoming flying objects. You know, think like 9/11 planes, right? No transponders, but you can see it. Those are the red diamonds that are on the perimeter of the United States. What happens typically on land when a wind farm interferes with military radar is there's typically other radars somewhat around, and they can try to backfill the gaps using the information from the other radar. You can't do that at sea because there are no other radars at sea. Next slide, please. This, again, is a picture of one offshore wind farm off the coast of New York, just to continue to highlight these conflicts here that have not been addressed by the United States government. On the right is a picture of the actual wind lease. It's sited between 2 traffic lanes into New York Harbor, some of the busiest traffic lanes in the world. Those are essentially superhighways for ships of all sizes, all kinds. And so think back to the radar interference issue, because that's a huge issue. They used to have a tower out there called Ambrose Tower. They took it down because too many tankers hit it. So now you're going to have hundreds of offshore wind turbines that create massive radar interference, and you've got tankers with oil, gas, chemicals, jet fuel, anything, you name it, heading into the port of New York. And that's a huge, huge problem. On the left, you'll also see, that was a picture that the Department of Homeland Security sent to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, I believe in 2014, telling them it's actually also a weapons trading area for the United States Coast Guard. But that, again, was also ignored. Next slide, please. This is a picture showing HF radar interference. HF radar is high-frequency radar. We have a system of radars along the coast of the US, and it monitors essentially ocean currents. And what that is used for is the Coast Guard uses it for search and rescue. So if a vessel sinks, they'll look at the HF radar to see what ways the currents are going, what directions, and at what speeds, so that they know where to start their search and rescue mission. So it helps the effectiveness of search and rescue for Coast Guard missions. It also is used by NOAA for oil spill response, so that if there is an oil spill, they kind of know where to start putting containment booms. On the left, you'll see the current coverage. On the right, you'll see what the coverage is going to be if they put in the wind farms in the leases that you see on the chart there. So essentially, you're going to lose all that coverage, and there's more leases that have been leased since this chart was created. So you're essentially going to lose not only Coast Guard's search and rescue capabilities because their own radar is not going to work inside of a wind farm, you're going to lose their search and rescue capabilities due to HF radar interference and loss. And none of this has actually been analyzed by the United States government to see what this means for the lives of US mariners. Next slide, please. So Bonnie and I have been dealing with this issue, writing so many comment letters that I cannot even count them all. Read thousands of pages of material. We've dived into various scientific studies. We've read everything that we can, commented, gone to hundreds of meetings with various officials, various agencies, states, developers, et cetera, et cetera. And basically, we've raised all these issues that have been like confirmed. We're not walking around with like tinfoil hats on our heads. These are real issues, and nobody cares. And it took recently until dead whales started washing up on the coasts of New York and New Jersey for anybody to actually care about these issues. I believe since December, from December to March, there's been, 27 whales that have died and washed up on beaches. And that's a big deal when you go to places like New Jersey and New York that are highly populated and it's a highly visible event. This kind of issue has never happened before. And essentially what's happening right now is that in the areas where the whales are washing up, they're washing up in the time and space that the offshore wind survey vessels are operating in the area. What the wind farm survey vessels do is essentially it's not really seismic testing, but it's a type of seismic testing to bottom profile the ocean floor to see where they can pile drive turbines, because they have to go in, hundreds of feet into the ocean floor. And whales use sound in every aspect of life. They live under the water. They don't see very well, but they hear. And so the equipment that is used by these vessels, NOAA has to authorize the offshore wind companies with what's called an incidental harassment authorization that gives the wind developers the permission to temporarily deafen the whales or to change their behavioral patterns, their breeding, their feeding, migration, things like that. So a lot of these whales also demonstrated indications of ship strikes, but a deaf whale is a dead whale. If the whale can't hear a vessel coming, it can't get out of the way, and none of this happened before the offshore wind surveys has started. And what's interesting is that we have, and I'll let Bonnie speak a little bit more to this, we've been saying, look, when the whale dies, only a handful of them get necropsied, which is like an autopsy for a whale. But they'll do things like take the length, estimated age, how much it weighed, but they're not looking at their inner auditory organs. So the government is saying, nothing to see here, folks, nothing to see here. Of course, this wasn't wind farm activity. It had nothing to do with this whatsoever. Whereas to any rational human being who can make a cause and effect connection and go, the whales didn't used to wash up, and now the wind farm survey started, and now all the whales are washing up. It's kind of a no-brainer. So what we're here, where we're at now with the stage that we're in is we're continuing to fight various other offshore leases that are being leased as quickly as possible. There is no analysis or very little analysis. The analysis is all done by the developers. Some of it now is saying, well, there's going to be no impacts to the ocean floor from either building the project and pile driving 94 turbines and laying 300 miles of cables or not. And really the developers are running the show. And hopefully, we're starting to get a little bit of traction in Congress. I attended a congressional field hearing in Wildwood, New Jersey last week and testified before several congressmen from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Maryland as to what our experiences have been. And, you know, hopefully now they're going to be able to raise the red flag and take it forward because we have national defense issues. We have Coast Guard search and rescue issues. We have maritime safety issues. And it is completely irresponsible to move forward without fully addressing all of those issues prior to construction, but that's not what's going on. And like I said, our lawsuit with the Texas Public Policy Foundation against fisheries impacts will see the court on April 3rd. So say a prayer for us. And I'll let Bonnie continue.
Hi, first of all.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Brady. I'm the Executive Director of the Long Island Commercial Fishing Association. Megan and I have been doing this for so long. I started in 2003 when Richie Kessler of LIPA wanted to put 200 megawatts of 2-megawatt turbines, cute little turbines, in state waters in the middle of our squid grounds. And at the time, the reason the project died 3 years later had absolutely nothing to do with the ocean, the whales, the nature, any of it. It was because it was 4 to 6 times more expensive than any other energy source. And at the time, LIPA and the state still cared about the ratepayers. Now, unfortunately, with purchase power agreements and clean energy standards, they are not held to that. And now we have a whole lot of offshore wind. Could you hit the first slide, please? No. I think we're at the next one. That's okay. And we'll keep going. Sorry. Back one. Or maybe it's gone. If not, I can wing it. Do we have that first one, Caleb? Okay, well, we'll go with this. You don't expect to go to a NASA page and be able to see turbines from space. But this, in fact, is what this is. Back in 2006 or 2008, I believe, Danish Oil and Natural Gas, that has changed their name to Ørsted, decided to put turbines in an area called the Thanet Wind Farm. It was a huge cod fishing ground for gillnet fishermen in England. When they put them in, no one paid, here we go. When they put them in, no one paid attention to things like tidal patterns or which way the wind goes. As a result, once they were placed, and those are about 0.6 of a mile apart, they wound up creating sediment plumes 24/7. By sediment plumes, I mean large piles of sand underwater that are approximately 500 feet wide and extend for up to 6 kilometers all the time. So all of the Thanet fishermen that used a drift gill net to catch their codfish, that was their grounds. Suddenly, shockingly, cod don't like sand in their gills. The cod are gone, and they were left with that. There are scour behind each turbine of up to 120 feet, and nothing can change what that scenario is. When I spoke to someone from Ørsted a couple years ago in a State of the Science conference in New York, I was informed no wind farm has ever done anything negative to the ocean ever. At which point I pointed that out to her. Not only that, next slide, please. NASA knows about it because in 2014, NASA wrote a paper about the fact that offshore wind farms make wakes. They literally extend, and that's a smaller site. So right now, they've done work in the last 5 or 6 years that says that the amount of wakes that can occur as a result of an offshore wind farm can extend for up to 100 kilometers behind the wind farm. That's for a lack of wind in the area, which affects the current. It will actually, and it's almost phantasmagorical to say this, it will decrease the upwelling and downwelling of the ocean. For all you fishermen in the room, upwelling, downwelling, how that primordial goo lifts up phytoplankton, zooplankton, everybody eats it, it's a cornucopia. It's going to decrease that, and it's going to increase sea surface temperature warming, which imitates climate change. Next slide, please. Here's the paper they wrote, Turbid Wakes Associated. And this was just in 2014 when they were little teeny turbines. The majority of the turbines in Europe, people go, oh, well, but they do it in Europe. They do it in inshore waters where maybe they had some lobster guys or some potters. They close off the areas, they paid off the fishermen, and they went about their day. That was before the EU changed to a common system where countries get a certain amount of quota and then it's divvy up amongst them. And many of them do their fishing in an area of the North Sea, which is now being bombarded again by offshore wind. Next slide, please. On the left, Merlin Jackson. On the right, oh my gosh, Colin Warwick. Merlin is from the Thanet Fishermen's Association. Colin is from the Crown Estate. In the UK, the reason why, let me move this up so I don't have to squat, there we go. In the UK is the only country where fishermen are still allowed inside offshore wind farms because Magna Carta told them you have the right to go out and fish. However, it was the Queen's ground, and now it's the King's ground, and they can basically put them wherever they want, and the fishermen, they have no say. So basically, little by little, they've lost all their grounds. Next slide, please. Back here in the US, we have our project, which is most local to us in 2010, the South Fork Wind Farm, which is a little spate of only, I believe, 12 turbines, about 56 miles of cable, and landing about 14 miles away from us in Montauk. This wind farm is on something called glacial moraine, which Rhode Island was the area that decided what wind energy area they wanted to create back in 2010. They did something called an ocean SAMP. Within that, if it was in state waters, there was a law that said you could not put it on glacial moraine. They wound up choosing this one in federal waters where the state of Rhode Island itself, their staff said when it was going to be approved that if they had the same property in state waters, 38% of it would have been removed due to habitat areas of particular concern for Atlantic cod. Right now, what we have here, according to the Bloomberg study, National Marine Fisheries Service did a paper and a letter to the federal government saying next slide, please. A sensitive ecological area that provides valuable habitat for a number of federally managed species. And the project has a high risk of population level impacts on southern New England Atlantic cod. And BOEM approved it. Next slide, please. In addition to that glacial moraine that they're really concerned about on the left is the Osbit 4200, which has actually had to bulldoze the ocean floor on that very sensitive cod habit where they're spawning. Next slide, please. Then they're going to lay 56 miles of cable with the Livingstone. Next slide. Except when it comes to offshore wind, those cables don't seem to stay in the water much. The Block Island Wind Farm, which you all have probably heard of as being a pretty 5 turbines. Oh, it's great. They put that into commission, I guess, in December of 2016, and in August of 2017, that cable came exposed. It's, I think, a free span of over 250 feet, 64,000 volts of cable. The other cable, there was one from the wind farm to Block Island, and then one from Block Island up to Narragansett. This one came exposed, this one to Narragansett, that one there, became exposed in August. The other cable became exposed in October. And the reason that they said they did is because of shifting seas and a dynamic environment. That's called the ocean. Next slide. It took 5 years for them to put the main cable to Narragansett back in the water because of those shifting seas. And guess who's paying for it? That's right. $30 million it's going to be charged to bills over a period of time in order to repay for that problem. Next slide. There's a little map. I should have explained it like that. That's just for one small cable. We're talking hundreds of thousands of miles of cables between every turbine, and then from the wind energy areas that Megan showed you in the map, all the way back. In some cases, they're straddling 2 or 3 states to get back. Next slide. Here's a picture from the Northeast Ocean Data Portal. It's really hard to get a picture of all of those wind energy areas local to us. If you look on that map and you see New Jersey, and then you go to that little island, that's Long Island for all of you that might not know, and by that little pink box there, that's where Montauk is. So off to the right there is the first Block Island wind farm there, and then you have where South Fork Wind Farm is going to be. And then you have that area of multicolored red, green, et cetera. That's the Rhode Island, Massachusetts wind energy area. Next slide. Pretty hefty site when you look at it close up. Basically, you can see Rhode Island. It's bigger than Rhode Island. You can see Cape Cod, Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, bigger than all of that. The Rhode Island, Massachusetts wind energy area alone, next slide, it's 2/3 the size of the Grand Canyon National Park. And they plan on putting turbines 1 nautical mile apart in every single direction, and then cable it. Let that sink in for a minute. Next slide. Pretty windmills. Block Island Wind Farm. Next slide. That's my husband's radar. As Megan mentioned before, I showed that actually at a New York meeting, and I remember the Coast Guard fellow sitting next to us going, "Holy bleep." On the left side, right in the outer circle, is where Block Island is. Those 5 lines up above that are the real turbines and the false turbines. And like Megan said, we were told by developers, oh, you just have to fix the gain. Oh, no, there's no problem. Next slide. No problem there. That's my friend Dave Tuman, the Restless, which is a long line boat. In the center there, and the 1 set of turbines, and then, oh wait, there's another set of turbines. There's 4 lines that time. Oh wait, over there's another set. Now, as Megan mentioned, imagine you're in fog, black fog, and you can't see. You don't know. They can say, oh, you'll notice the wind turbine feel from outside of it, but the second you go in, you don't know what's there because you'll see things everywhere. Next slide. This is the Thanet Wind Farm. Some scallopers went over a couple of years ago, and the fellow in the boat there, you can see where that larger arrow I have, that is actually his radar that he's looking at right there, and the smaller arrow shows one of the Thanet turbines itself. Next slide. So those pretty turbines are not what we're getting. Vineyard Wind, I believe 12 megawatt or 12 to 14. They still haven't decided yet. But as you can see on the list there, we're somewhere around the Eiffel Tower size at that point. These are huge, huge structures. Each blade is about, I think, the size of a football field. Next slide. Ooh, electric service platform. Who wants substations in the ocean? We do, we do. There's even one that, for the Sunrise Wind Farm, they want a cooling water intake system, which you all may probably know, those of you involved with electricity. But let's take the ocean, where there's things like larvae in areas that cod spawning exists, and let's do a cooling water intake system and take 8.1 million gallons per day of seawater, run it through and release it as 90-degree effluent. I wonder what that'll do to your cod stocks. That's what they want to do at the Sunrise Wind Farm. Next slide. Quickly, when Megan was talking about whales, yeah, we've learned more about whales than either one of us. Did you ever want to know anything? No, right, exactly. You'll hear they have them refer to takes. A take doesn't mean a killing necessarily. It means any of these: harassment, anything that has the potential to injure or the potential to disturb. So breathing, nursing, feeding. Incidental means not intentional, does not mean unexpected. Next slide. You'll see here level A and level B. Level A is permanent deafness or injury. That's if you blow up a bomb with a UXO, which they're planning on doing so. Or, things like large sound issues, because in addition to the sound itself, there's particle motion of the ocean itself. But level B is the temporary threshold shifts in hearing. That's temporary deafness. So over the past 3 months, our joke has been, well, how long is a whale deaf for? About as long as it takes to get hit by a ship. They're choosing to ignore this. As Megan said, the necropsies they're doing, they're not checking the ears. It's a difficult process, but there's no Whale Go team, NCIS, where they show up and they get in and get the ears and test it. There's nothing. In Europe, they had over 1,000 strandings 1 year of whales and other cetaceans. But when the government is in charge of offshore wind, nothing to see there either. Next slide, please. So you can see on this slide mysticetes, which are baleen whales, which are your humpbacks, your North Atlantic right whale, your minke whale. On this list here, you've got the variety of things, obviously air guns, which it isn't, pile driving, which it will be, and then you have the high-resolution geophysical equipment. The boomers, sparkers, and the chirpers all fall in line with the hearing profile of baleen whales. And when you have 17 ENGOs 3 years ago send a letter saying, we are concerned about the profound effects of cumulative surveys upon these animals. And then last year, they even sent a letter where 15 of them also spoke to over 108 survey boats at surveys at the same time, zigzagging back and forth through the ocean floor. These whales have migratory corridors, and we believe there's really not a whole lot of places for them to go, and the cumulative effect is disorienting them. When they rise to surface, they're getting whacked by ships. Next slide. And the fun fact I found out, about a month ago, in 2019, NOAA did a reset of some of the sound profiles for what is considered an acute versus an operational sound, and whether it's considered temporary harassment versus more severe. It turns out for low-frequency cetaceans, which are baleen whales, there is no direct hearing data, behavioral or electrophysiological, that's available at any frequency for any species. So they modeled the results. They know what it is for toothed whales, the Odoncetes, but they do not know for baleen. So they're winging it. Next slide. Oh, is that it? Okay, I just want to point out over here on the table next to it, you've got level A for, I believe, that might be Sunrise, or it's Revolution. They're staying straight up, they're going to deafinate whales. Like Megan said, a deaf whale is soon to be a dead whale. I want to just tell one quick story and I'll run. we never wanted to be in this. 2017, we're in a certain DC office that has 5 sides to it. I locked my phone into a little box, and so does Megan, and we go in and speak to some people because the structure of BOEM is the agency that approves. Everybody else falls out underneath. They can tell people what's going on and what the issue is, but they're only cooperative agencies with BOEM is making the decisions. So if BOEM doesn't want to agree with them, they say, thank you so much for your time, and then they do it anyway. So Megan and I are in this 5-sided building just across the way from DC with our phones locked in as we speak to someone who tells us about all of the issues with national security, high-frequency radar, terminal radar for intermediate airports, the ability of search and rescue to not work, all of this. I'm scribbling on I used to be a reporter. I'm scribbling this information on a napkin while it's being told to us. We walk out, it was January, it was freezing. I'm wearing pantyhose, so ladies, you understand, it's really cold and I'm wearing pantyhose. I look at her in the parking lot, I was just blown away. You know, I never expected to know that these things create national security concerns. I look at her after we come out of the meeting and I say, I think Reese Witherspoon should play you in the movie. Great, I have time. Just can I show the one video? Could you guys show that video? By the way, this is my husband. He's a commercial fisherman since 1973. He's a trawler fisherman, and this is the environment that he's coming into the inlet in Montauk right now. It was a little windy. Snow gives it a great effect. This is what these guys deal with every day. And that's without any obstacles other than the rocks on the inlet to deal with. Now imagine what they're going to do to our ocean. Hopefully you guys can stop them from doing it to yours too. Thanks.
Good afternoon. I'm Ernie LaFleur, co-chairman of the summit this year. And I have the pleasure of introducing our last 2 speakers, both of whom are part of the CO2 Coalition. When I left EOG Resources a few years ago, in addition to joining some boards and geoscience societies, et cetera, I had an eminent scientist that told me about the CO2 Coalition and the great work they were doing, and suggested that I should join that organization, which I did, and became a member scientist there. And so I had the pleasure of meeting the 2 individuals you'll be hearing today. The CO2 Coalition is very interesting. It's a nonprofit of a wide range of scientists, both geosciences, atmospheric physics, meteorology, environmentalists in academia, industry, and government. So it's a very diverse group, and as we all know, CO2 is a building block of life. Without CO2 and H2O, none of us would be here today. And so when you talk about regulating it, well, what's the right level? At what point will you be impacting life? How much is a greenhouse issue? And so there are many issues that need serious investigation, and that's the focus of this group. The first speaker from the CO2 Coalition that we'll be talking to is Dr. Patrick Moore. Dr. Moore is widely acknowledged as a worldwide environmental authority. You may have seen him recently interviewed in Tucker Carlson tonight, but he's received awards around the world in countless environmental studies. He was a co-founder of Greenpeace. He's written several best-selling books, and today we have the pleasure of him reviewing his latest book and a presentation that was the keynote at the International Climate Conference in Orlando just 3 weeks ago. And he'll review that book and some of his latest findings that I think you'll find very interesting regarding the impact on the environment and the proper levels of CO2 as we consider climate change and energy policy. So with that, he's in British Columbia. We tried to get him here in person, but it's 2 days of travel each way. So for a 40-minute talk, we decided to do it for the first time at the conference, a live virtual presentation by Dr. Moore. And so please give him a welcoming applause, and then we'll go virtual with Dr. Patrick Moore from British Columbia.
Thank you very much, Ernie. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. It's still the morning here on the east coast of Vancouver Island. Can you see my title slide there? Is that all working? Yes, it's working. Well, I'll just mention a couple of things. That's the cover of my most recent book, Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. You will perish in flames. These people actually, at a political level, are trying to achieve a policy that would end up killing half the people on the earth. And this is just a fact. If we stop using nitrogen fertilizer and we banned fossil fuels, there wouldn't be many of us left, because they are what are keeping us alive every day. And these people are purely political. They use the word green as a political term. It has nothing to do with environment. It's strictly political. And they don't like the greening of the earth for some reason. You can see the map there. This is by the top science body in Australia, showing the 30-year increase in vegetation in some of the driest parts of the world, because additional CO2 also makes plants more thrifty with water, and they can therefore grow and grow faster in places that they couldn't grow before. This is where I grew up, so I have a fairly good understanding of the ocean and the forest. My little house there on a float camp, my dad's logging camp in Winter Harbor, where there was no road until 1965. When the road came, we thought, boy, oh boy, now this place will really grow. Half the people use the road to get out. So I learned something about human nature that day. This is the University of British Columbia, where I first did my honors BSc in forestry and biology, and then my PhD in ecology. While I was doing my PhD in ecology, this was the hippie era, I joined this little group in a church basement in Vancouver, which became Greenpeace, and sailed on the first voyage. This is on the way up to the Aleutian Islands to protest the U.S. hydrogen bomb testing, their underground 5 megaton bomb. And it worked. We got on Walter Cronkite. Tens of thousands of people marched in the street on both sides of the border, and President Nixon canceled the remaining planned hydrogen bomb test, and that was the last hydrogen bomb test the United States ever did. Here we are on our way up to Alaska, a motley crew, but all of these people are professionals. Most of them are gone from this earth, but there's still, let's see. Nope, I don't know of any that are still here, except me, of course. I'm under the P. Here I'm sitting on a baby seal off the east coast of Labrador, and I was taken to jail where they removed my belt in case I thought I should hang myself. But anyways, I guess that's protocol. This stopped the slaughter of 250,000 baby seals still nursing on their mother. And it was a cruel thing they were doing, to be doing this in this age. There was a time, perhaps, when it could be justified for the seal meat, but at this point, all they were looking for was the fur on these beautiful creatures. And it's a long story, but it ended well. This is the first encounter with the Soviet factory whaling fleet in the North Pacific. 4 voyages. I was on all of them. I'm driving that little boat with my late friend Fred Easton, the cameraman there. And we confronted these whalers for 4 years in a row in the Pacific, sometimes 500 to 1,000 miles from land. And there's the whales being brought into the factory ship. They go up that big hole in the back there and get cut up on deck. And what we did was we put ourselves, that's me driving there in front of the harpoon to protect the fleeing whales. And we did this for 4 years. We had many encounters. And here is one in video form. This was the first one we brought back, showing what we were doing, and it was seen around the world. It just went completely viral. So the Zodiac is going out to get in front of the harpoon. You can see the harpooner is at the harpoon. They're chasing a whale, which is on the far right there. That's the whale. The boat.
I was afraid we were going to overrun the whales. You can see the shoulder with the blowhole come right out of the water. And then we could see the guy crouching, getting ready to shoot. The only rule we kept was every time they pointed the gun another way, we'd swivel in front of them. And we came up on one wave, and there he was, and we were looking right in the. I thought we had a flood, but he couldn't possibly shoot. Then we went down, and then that fantastic sound, and you could hear the of the cable. I guess we both ducked at that point, and I don't know what happened.
Chairman, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, you can see how emotional that all was for us. It was quite a situation. And we did that for 4 years, at the end of which we managed to convince the International Whaling Commission to end the slaughter of 30,000 whales every year in the North Pacific. And that was that. Why did I then leave Greenpeace after 15 years in the top committee? I was one of 6 international directors from when we created Greenpeace International in 1979. But what happened was we were Greenpeace, and the peace stood for humanitarianism. We cared about people, but Greenpeace lost that completely, as did the rest of the environmental movement, saying that humans are the enemies of nature, the enemies of the earth, as if we are the only bad species. It's way too much like original sin for me. I just don't buy that. And today they peddle junk science for donations. They basically, I had to leave when the sharp end of the stick was they decided to have a campaign, worldwide ban on chlorine, the element chlorine. Well, now chlorine can be very poisonous as an element. It was used as a weapon by the Germans in the First World War. And since that, those kind of chemical warfares have been banned. But the fact of the matter is, chlorine is one of the most important elements for our health. Salt, for example, sodium chloride, is an essential nutrient for pretty well all life, including us. It has chlorine in it. So banning chlorine worldwide is such a stupid thing to say, never mind do. And then there's the fact that adding chlorine to drinking water and swimming pools was the biggest advance in the history of public health, preventing the spread of cholera and other waterborne communicable diseases. And then, in addition to that, 85% of our pharmaceuticals, our medicines, are made with chlorine chemistry, and there's 25% of them have chlorine in them. Look at the ingredients on your cold and flu medication, for example. Well, of course, I had to leave. And when I left, I vowed to become a sensible environmentalist, basing my positions on science and logic. That's the reasoning part of things, instead of misinformation, sensationalism, and fear. That's where these guys went. The left basically hijacked Greenpeace. The Biden administration, as you heard recently, just before me, I got a chance to listen to much of that presentation. It was very well done. 1,500 large turbines, where there's the feeding ground for 4,500 humpback whales and less than 400 endangered North Atlantic right whales. I wrote this piece, which was published. There's a 400% increase in whale deaths since 2016. Greenpeace has sided with the machines over the living whales. They have betrayed their whole founding purpose, the purpose of saving whales. In this case, they're on the side of the machines. It's just so disgusting. I can't stand it, but this is where it's gone. Just a little history of life. Life started about 3.5 to 4 billion years ago as single-celled life. And it wasn't until 2.6 billion years ago that photosynthesis occurred, when life learned to combine carbon dioxide with water and make sugar, which is the energy for all of life. So this was one of the most important things. Then sexual reproduction happened, which made evolution much faster. And then multicellular life. This was the explosion called the Cambrian explosion, starting 1 billion years ago, but mostly happening in the 500 million to 600 million year period. Look how many important things happened then. And here we are on the front of this time scale, having achieved 8 billion, nearly 8 billion human beings, and at the same time protecting vast areas of the earth. It's a lie that the Amazon is being destroyed. It's a lie that the Congo is being destroyed. I'll talk to you more about that. This is what life looked like to the naked eye for the first 3 billion years. It was microscopic and confined to the oceans, so you couldn't even see it. Then sponges came. This is the Cambrian explosion, 600 million years ago, the first species of multicellular life. So anatomy, or cellular differentiation, occurred at this time, and this is what went on. I don't know if you've ever heard of Stephen Jay Gould's Wonderful Life, but this is a wonderful book for anybody who wants to understand the evolution of life on Earth. And he noted that if you could be thinking of the evolution of life as a tape, if you rolled it back to the beginning and started over, it would never come out the same way again, because there are so many factors involved. It's sort of like the climate in that way. And the idea that these people think they can predict the climate 50 years from now is so completely ridiculous, because climate is chaotic, the weather is chaotic and multifactored and nonlinear. They've even admitted that in the IPCC. But the fact of the matter is, there is no crystal ball. It is a mythical object, and a computer model is not a predictor of the future. It's just something to play with and put your assumptions in and see what happens. 500 to 550 million years ago, almost all the species were soft. In other words, they had no shells. And it was the evolution of shells that created a situation where life basically did something that was going to result in the end of life. They didn't do it on purpose. They did it on purpose to have armor plating. But all these sea creatures that take calcium and combine it with carbon dioxide in the ocean have sucked out 100 million billion tons of carbon as carbon dioxide from the seas and deposited it on the bottom of the ocean, where it becomes limestone, chalk, marble, and dolomite. All those rocks are of life origin, and they contain over 99% of the carbon dioxide that was ever in the atmosphere in the first place. Nobody knows about this, but basically burning fossil fuels and making cement, the fossil fuels, of course, are from plants in the sea and on the land, and animals in the sea. We are not telling people the right story here. Every CO2 molecule that we release from burning fossil fuels and making cement came from the atmosphere or the oceans in the first place. And the atmosphere and the oceans are in equilibrium with CO2. If there's more CO2 in the air, some of it goes into the ocean. If there's more CO2 into the ocean, some of it goes into the atmosphere. At the surface, it's exchanging and keeping an equilibrium according to an actual physical law. And this is too complicated even for me, but I could spend about 4 hours on it. Basically, this is to show you that temperature, which is the blue line, and CO2, which is the purple line, are out of sync with each other slightly more often than they are in sync. This does not represent a cause-effect relationship. There is correlation in some areas. Who knows why? There's more we don't know about this than we do know, except we do know that there was an ice age when CO2 was 5,000 ppm. That's the Silurian ice age. the first one shown there. And then another huge ice age, the Karoo, which lasted 100 million years. And also during that time, CO2 went down. But then the temperature shot right back up again while CO2 was way down. And you can see the final tail there from 146 million years ago to the present is caused by the removal of CO2 by the shellfish, the coral reefs, the clams, the mussels, the barnacles, all of the crabs and everything that has a shell has been removing that CO2 and putting it on the bottom of the ocean as sediments where it turns into rocks. And that little uptick at the very end is what we have done, as if that's going to destroy the planet or kill everything. It's just so ridiculous. If you just look at this, this is only 570 million years out of the 3.5 billion. This is my favorite thing to point out, that correlation, even if it is strong, is still not necessarily causation. Shark attacks and ice cream sales have far higher correlation than CO2 and temperature. But shark attacks don't cause ice cream sales, and ice cream sales don't cause shark attacks. They are caused by a third common factor, which is called temperature. In the winter, people don't eat ice cream and don't go swimming. In the summer, they go to the beach, have an ice cream cone, go swimming, and some of them get attacked by a shark. But it's not a causation relationship. And there's way more correlations than there are causations. Go to this website, Spurious Correlations. Here we have a perfect correlation between the number of people who drown falling into a pool correlates with films Nicolas Cage appeared in. There's hundreds of these which have nothing to do with each other, but are caused by whatever, who knows? It's spurious. The Carboniferous period was when 50% of all the coal in the world was produced. And many people think that the reason this huge decline back there in 363 million years ago to 290, 246, that area there, many people think that the coal was produced because there was no species that could eat wood like fungus does. And eventually, a species evolved that could digest wood. But up until then, for 100 million years or so, the forest just grew on top of the dead trees and made these huge coal deposits. You can see how thick this one is. That's not just going to happen in 3 years. That's going to take hundreds of thousands of years in order to get that size of coal, because it compacts very much as it turns from wood into fossil fuel. This is the fungus that developed the enzyme lignase to digest lignin in wood, because lignin didn't get invented until plants figured out how to become trees by making a tall, strong stem, and the bulk of that is cellulose and lignin. Cellulose was invented long ago, back in the ancient times in the sea, but the lignase, once it was invented, it's all through the system of life now. Way too much to talk about. This is the last 65 million years when the dinosaur extinction occurred, and many other extinctions were with it. We're almost certain it was an asteroid that hit the Yucatan that caused the sky to go dark for enough years to kill most of the plants. And interestingly, the birds survived, the only dinosaurs that survived, because they could fly and find dead animals everywhere and eat them and stayed alive. Down it goes, the temperature. This is where we are today at 0. We are in the Pleistocene Ice Age. It has been 2.6 million years long. Here is the Pleistocene Ice Age, showing it coming down from 5.5 million years ago. Look at all the ups and downs there. There's been at least 40, maybe 45 cycles of glaciation and interglacial periods. We, as you probably know, are in an interglacial period called the Holocene, but by all history of the previous cycles, which we have, we are now beginning the long 80,000 year descent into the next glacial maximum. So we don't need to worry about our grandchildren too much about that, because it just is a very slow process. Here's the last 4 interglacial periods, well, including our Holocene. As you can see, all 3 of the previous interglacial periods were warmer than this one. Polar bears survived through at least the Bouchette and the Eemian. So if polar bears survived through that, then they're going to survive through the Holocene because it's already been the warmest it's ever going to get. That is just an actual fact. There's no way it's going to get warmer than it is now. And here's what Al Gore, the big lie of Al Gore. He's up on a ladder there on the right side. You can just see his face, showing people where CO2 is today and claiming that CO2 is what's caused that little blip in temperature there. Well, if you go back in time, you find that there's an 800-year lag between when the temperature rises and then the CO2 rises. It's temperature that's causing the fluctuations in CO2, not the other way around. When the oceans warm, they give off CO2. When the oceans cool, they absorb CO2. It's a known physical fact, and it's known that there's an 800-year lag, and the cause never comes after the effect. So this is still being pushed by Al Gore and Kerry and all these people, saying that the ice cores from the Vostok in Antarctica show that the CO2 is caused. Sorry, the temperature is caused by the CO2. It's the absolute other way around. And here's where we are in the last 5,000 years. The Minoan warming was about as high as the temperature ever has got in the 10,000 year period of the Holocene. It basically marked the end of the Holocene maximum. Now we are in a decline with the Roman, the medieval, and the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age was colder than it has been since we came out of the previous glaciation. So it would appear as though we are now in that 80,000 year downward decline, and that CO2 has virtually nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with greening the Earth and getting back on an even keel again. You can see here the temperature. This is from central England. It's the longest continuous temperature record with a thermometer. That's when they invented it, probably back in 1659 there. As you can see, the first two yellow lines on the left show a period where the temperature increased for as long a period and by more than the previous one that we're in now, since 1965 or so. So there's no indication, with that black line being the CO2 emissions from humans, there is no indication that it is having an effect on temperature. This is simply the modern warm period coming out of the Little Ice Age, and we could expect it to last for another 200 years and maybe get up another degree or so. You know, they're saying 1.5 degree increase, and we've already made 1 degree, so they're saying a 0.5% Celsius increase will kill all of life on Earth or something along those lines. That's less than the difference in average temperature between Washington, D.C. and New York. Never mind the equator and New York. I mean, it's just complete balderdash. There's no truth to any of it. Here is the latest global average tropospheric temperature. And these are very small changes from 0.5 to 0.5, kind of, like 1 degree from the lowest to the highest. And yes, it is slightly warming. And that's what we would expect coming out of the Little Ice Age, just like when we came out of the Dark Ages, just like when we came out of the period between the Romans and the Minoans, there were cold periods on a 500-year cycle from warming to cooling, 500 years to warming, 500 years to cooling, 500 years. That's the way it's worked for the last 5,000 years. This is a wonderful chart. I updated it from 2010 with changing the numbers for burning fossil fuels and atmospheric content. Otherwise, I've left it like it was, and it's probably not perfect, but it's close enough. And what this shows you is the number of millions of tons of carbon are in all these flows and stocks. The red are flows, annual flows in many cases. The blue is stocks. How much is there now? So plants have 560 million tons of carbon in them, and soils have 1,500, between the two, 2,000. So more than twice as much CO2 as is now in the very depleted atmosphere that we have been left with because of the shellfish. Don't be mad at them. They didn't do it on purpose. Oh, there they are again. The coccolithophores are beautiful. They're the ones on the left there. They're microscopic. You can't see them, but there's billions of them. I'd say trillions of them. They make up a very large part of the marine plankton. They are plants. They photosynthesize. On the very far right is a foraminifera. They're about the size of a tiny grain of sand. And that network there, those holes, are large enough to take a coccolithophore in as they graze through the bloom of plankton. The sea is a wonderful place. I've been snorkeling in it in the Coral Triangle many times. This is the White Cliffs of Dover. They are made of coccolithophores. There's millions of tons of carbon that has been taken out of the sea and made into this beautiful landscape. And these are some of the shapes of foraminifera. The marine life is easily as interesting as the terrestrial life, and especially here. This is in the Coral Triangle, which is in Indonesia, a part of Polynesia, and Samoa. It's the most biodiverse reefs in the world, with 600 species plus of corals and 2,000 species of reef fish. And if the world gets warmer, it will expand, not die. The reason it's the most biodiverse is because it's the warmest ocean in the world. The Caribbean lost 50% of its coral species as we cooled, like I showed you, from the Eocene thermal maximum to the Pleistocene ice age that we're in now. Again, the amazing 100,000 species of mollusks in the sea. And then there's the crustaceans. They have a different shell, as you know, that they're not rigid. So they're made out of a chitinous material with some calcium carbonate to make it smooth and watertight. Okay, here's the most important graph in the world. The projected level of CO2 in absence of human emissions. There's right up until that dotted line, most recent glacial maximum. That is all natural. And even beyond that, it's the increase in CO2 that we have created, where it says present level 421. It's actually 424.5 now from when I wrote this. The death of plants occurs at 150 ppm. If we had not come along and started putting some of the CO2 back into the atmosphere where it came from in the first place, life would have gone out with a whimper. As soon as it gets down to 150, plant life begins to die. And it is believed that high elevation forests died during the 180 ppm period, which lasted, for nearly 1,000 years. This is the Royal Horticultural Society. Apparently there's scientists in there. It's true you really should talk to your plants. Well, it is true, but it's not about talking. It's about you breathing 50,000 ppm of CO2 on them, when in fact the room maybe has 1,000, because you're in it and the whole room gets a little bit more CO2 than is outside in the air. But 50,000 ppm, if you sit close to your plants and talk to them, all you have to do really is breathe on them. You don't have to make up any talking. They can't talk, they can't hear, but they can take in your CO2 when you exhale it. This is a perfectly good example of how not to manage forests and communities. As you can see, they built these suburbs in a coniferous forest, mostly of pitchy pine trees. And matter of fact, the pines did better than the houses. This was burnt right to the ground. And 90 people or so died in this fire. So it was a human tragedy as well as just a plain tragedy. This is people who do not understand forest ecology. When you have new suburbs being built, you should look at Central Park in New York. Notice there are no coniferous trees there. It'd be okay if there was a few spread around, but mostly the broadleaf trees, which are not pitchy and do not create the same firestorm conditions that a coniferous forest does when it crowns up into the tops of the trees and goes faster than any horse or human can run. It's just a natural thing. And they say all these fires in the West are being caused by climate change. No, they're mostly happening on public lands, mainly federal lands, controlled from Washington. Most of the federal lands are in the west of the Mississippi. Most of the politicians are east of the Mississippi. So they can do all kinds of goody two-shoes sounding things and not have to pay the price for their constituents, because their constituents are unaffected by what happens in the West. However, in the Southeast, you don't see these huge forest fires because those forests are being managed properly. It is necessary to manage forests if you want to live next to them. In the old days, before fossil fuels, every fall, people collected all the dead wood around their communities and their cities to have fuel in the winter. And in fact, in Europe, Western and Eastern Europe combined, they started to use more wood than was growing back naturally. And by 1750, the forests of all of Europe had been reduced to less than 10% of the area. We started using fossil fuels, and today the forests of Europe cover 43% of Europe, and still they're complaining about the forest disappearing. They're not disappearing. They are regrowing. There's a larger area of forest between Canada and the United States now than there was in 1900. The Chinese and the Indian people, have put more forest back into where there was once agriculture or land that had been cleared. They have reforested them to combine amount of forest more than anyone else in the world has done in the last 25 years. And this is why a fire starts and burns down every living thing. The Forest Service, the U.S. Forest Service, now, especially since President Biden was brought in, has dropped the history that comes before that black line there. They've discarded all that data. When asked why, they say, because we don't know who did this. They did it. It was the U.S. Forest Service. Who else would be keeping track of how much land was burned every year? And that's the graph they showed. That's their graph. But they have now just put the history in the garbage can. And so now they show that the forests are increasing in the amount of area being burned, and they say it's because of climate change. No, it's because of mismanagement by green politicians in cities telling people what they should do out there, which is basically nothing. And that will result, after 20 years of buildup of dead wood and limbs on the ground, will result in catastrophic wildfires. This is Europe today. I mentioned that it was 10% and now it's 43. Well, this is the 43% of Europe that is forested today. Here is the Amazon watershed. This is a satellite image. Some areas have been turned into agriculture, but most of it in the center is pretty much intact. And here is the Congo, even more intact. And they say it's being destroyed, et cetera, et cetera. And there's one of those beautiful woodland gorillas there. And we are managing somehow to make sure they're not killed. The people there don't like them for various reasons, just like they don't like tigers in India. But people are working to save them, and it's working. Here's NASA's Greening of the Earth chart. The people that do the spaceships and stuff, a big group of retired NASA people are called the good stuff. I forget how it goes now. Climate stuff, that's right climate stuff, that's what they call themselves. And they are skeptics of the climate change destruction of the world politics, and they only can say that because they're retired. If you're in NASA, even though you know that this greening of the earth is happening, you can't talk about it too much. It's just ridiculous. And that is my presentation, folks. I was told that if I hadn't taken up my 45 minutes, there could be a short Q&A. If that's possible, I'd be happy to engage with you in it. I'd like you to buy my book. It's on Amazon.com. And so is my previous one, Confessions of a Greenpeace Dropout, The Making of a Sensible Environmentalist. It'll show you that near my book, near this book if you go there. This book's only 200 pages and it has over 100 illustrations and photographs. It is accessible to anybody proficient in English. And I think if you read it, you would give it to your teenage children and see if they would be interested in learning something about a lot of things. It goes from GMOs to plastic to tree forests around the world to Attenborough saying the walruses committed suicide when in fact it was a pack of polar bears that were coming for them, and that's why they rolled down the cliff and died, because they'd rather do that than be eaten alive by a polar bear. And so between Attenborough and Al Gore, you've got a couple of the world's biggest propagandists. They simply do not tell the truth, and they make a lot of money doing that. And I think it's despicable myself. Thank you for listening. Is it possible to have a Q&A? I haven't actually talked to anybody.
Hey, Patrick,
Oh, I did talk to Ernie when he introduced me. That's right. So it must be possible, unless it's not possible. And if it isn't possible,
Patrick, can you hear me? Can you hear me, Patrick?
Yes.
Okay. We have a few minutes, so we can take a few questions. But before we take those questions, let's give Patrick a big round of applause.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
We have just a few minutes. If anyone has a question they'd like to direct to Patrick, just tell me, and then I'll repeat it so Patrick can actually hear it. Anyone in the audience has a question for Patrick? Well, Patrick, I think everyone's intimidated by your massive knowledge of the world. So,
it is a bit of a compliment when you don't get a question. I suppose I should take it that way, unless everybody wants to distance themselves from me, and I don't think that's the case. Very good. It's been a great pleasure to be able to speak to you live. It was coming down there from Vancouver Island. You would not believe the nightmare travel experience I would have had to take. And I think I hope it's been just as good by Zoom. I think this is a wonderful technology to get people together when it is difficult to be in the same place. So thanks very much for listening, and I wish you a good conference and a successful day. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to have our next speaker, Greg Goodnight, who's also with the CO2 Coalition. But you've probably picked up a little theme that's occurring in today's conference, and that's, offshore wind may not be everything that we've been led to believe, but you may be asking yourself, we're in Texas here. Why am I worried about offshore wind? And I'm at the energy conference. Why am I talking about all these types of things? Well, some of you may or may not be aware that the federal government has put out for comment the first set of offshore lease sales that will be happening offshore Galveston to Beaumont. Over 300,000 acres of near-shore environment is being put up for comment for the first series of lease sales that will be happening in our Gulf of Mexico, which is very rich fishing grounds and important for the state of Texas. So it's not an issue that we can ignore. It's coming our way, and we need to understand it. Additionally, there are great challenges to our power grid that we're all well aware of being here in Texas with this intermittent power. Today, nearly 30% of our power comes from wind. However, it's very intermittent, and it can go in a space of 24 hours from 30% to 3% as we witnessed in Uri. And our next speaker, Greg Goodnight, an engineer of over 45 years, has been studying this issue in great detail and will tell us much more about the issues related to wind and also energy policy. Greg has gotten his engineering degrees from the University of Texas at Austin, and in the chemical engineering, a master's degree from University of Pennsylvania. He did a wide range of industry efforts from DuPont to Monsanto, and then on to the financial industry, where he was a key energy analyst for UBS, which of course been in the news recently with their acquisition of Credit Suisse. But Greg is very detailed in his analysis of what has happened in the Texas energy grid over the last number of years, and it's our pleasure today to introduce him to share that with us today. Please welcome Greg Goodnight.
When we were queuing up my PowerPoint, it wasn't working. Last time that happened, I normally speak to about 20 people. So I came in from my, I was actually at a rehearsal. I played cello. And so we were getting trying to get the PowerPoint ready, and it wouldn't work. And I had my cello there. I said, look, I can play my cello for you a little bit if they want. But they didn't want that. And they're smart. They're smart people. I want to see if this thing works here. Okay, it works beautifully. I'm probably a lot where a lot of you folks are. I was there 6 years ago. When I retired in 2017, I had a binder about this thick that had climate change stuff in it. And all through the years when I was working as an engineer and working as a equity analyst in the bank, I kept saying, this thing doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense for science. It's highly politicized and all that. I'm going to figure this thing out when I retire. And so that's what got me started. And I looked into this, and that's probably a lot where you are. What in the world is going on? I mean, the thing doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So I started doing this by myself, and then eventually I said, well, I'm going to start networking. And I've networked now with the CO2 Coalition and the Right Climate stuff in Houston. And these are very incredible groups. This Patrick Moore is just phenomenal. He's my hero. So I'm really substituting for the executive director of the CO2 Coalition, Greg Wrightstone, who wrote a terrific book called Inconvenient Facts, which is a point by point answer to Al Gore's book. And it's been on the New York Times bestseller list and like. I would encourage you, if you're starting on the climate change journey, like I started 6 years ago, grab that book. It has a lot of good stuff in it. So let's go through what I've done a little in recent times. What I did is looked at the Uri storm, the Elliott storm, and I've done some analysis and presentations. You can go to the Heartland website. We just gave a presentation. Our panel did. The Right Climate Stuff panel gave a presentation, 8A. It's panel 8A. You can go on the website and see my presentation there. So I'm not going to be able to talk, for time constraints, too much about Uri and Elliott and like, but you'll see some of the residual here. Okay, so I am representing CO2 Coalition and Right Climate Stuff, but primarily myself. I'm a native Texan, and I have my own independent thinking, as all Texans do, right? I have a don't mess with Texas tie, and I've just learned don't mess with Rhode Island either. If after Megan, I wouldn't even come close to messing with her. So climate change. CO2 does not drive the climate, period. There's a geological context for climate change. If you look at the 130 members of the CO2 Coalition, we're very overrepresented in geologists. They get it. They understand what's been going on. There is some anthropogenic global warming, but there's a narrative that far exceeds the reality. Is there a case for alarmism? We're going to talk about that. Renewable energy intermittency. There are two issues with renewable energy. One is it's intermittent, the other it's very dilute. It takes a lot of resources to make renewable energy, windmills and solar panels. The war on coal and fossil fuels is the one that I really want to focus on. I'm going to run through some of the stuff that's repetitive what Patrick said in a way, but I'm going to focus you on the war on coal, and that's the first target. The next one's going to be fossil fuels. Coal power is essential and is not a climate villain. This is what I learned from Uri. This is what I learned from Elliott. And this is why I try to stay active in the field. The CO2 Climate Coalition, their positions, carbon dioxide is an essential trace gas, 0.04% of 400 to 420 parts per million, in that range. The amount of anthropogenic warming associated with CO2 is small. For a doubling, you get 1 degree, and we've gone up 40% CO2, so you get 1 degree times 0.4 or 40% and get 0.4 degrees. So that's how much CO2 has contributed to global warming. It's not been the majority of global warming. It's a portion. It's small, but it's been beneficial. Patrick talked to you about crop yields, and there is no case for the demonization of CO2. We hear CO2 pollution, that is baloney. CO2 is not pollution. It's harmless. It's a harmless gas that causes a very mild increase in global temperatures over a long-term period, but nowhere near a case for alarmism. Avoid public policy decisions based on questionable climate change. The public policy has been hijacked, in my view, through the active efforts of the people pushing this narrative. The war on coal and other fossil fuels is extremely bad for humanity. It's not only bad for us, but you look at sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, where they haven't had power. Their life is, they're carrying water and burning with wood, and it's pretty miserable. So they need to get electrified and join the rest of the world. CO2 is at a historically low point. Patrick mentioned this. We are near the dangerous level of 150 parts per million. So it's bad. So CO2 is beneficial. This is CO2 Coalition. Now, what I'm going to talk to you a little bit is I'm going to tell you a few more details in terms of the geologic history that Patrick talked about. If you look at we have 4.6 billion years of the Earth's history. If you look at the last 600 million years, you've had carbon dioxide up at 7,000 parts per million, and we got down to like 190 parts per million pre the Industrial Revolution. Now, the evolution of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is not only anthropogenic, burning fossil fuels, but it's also, like Patrick mentioned, potentially degassing of the ocean. About 1 degree level of seawater temperature rise will explain a lot of that carbon dioxide. Maybe not all. It's a little bit debatable, but that's certainly a factor. This is another chart showing that we're at low levels in a geologic standpoint of CO2. We're not going to spend much time on that. I wanted to mention this chart. This is another chart Patrick showed. We have 100,000 years bumps. Our current cycle, we've gotten into a pattern where we have these so-called interglacials. We're in, like Patrick said, an ice age right now. But we have these interglacials that last for 10 to 12,000 years, where we have unusually high temperatures, even despite the fact that we're in an ice age. Now, one thing you need to notice, let's see if does this thing work? It doesn't look like it. Okay. Well, if you notice the peaks of those things, they're sharp and they come down pretty fast. Where are we in our Holocene interglacial period we're at now? Well, they turned out to be 10 to 12,000 years, and we're getting towards the end. So it's quite possible. If you look at the temperature, 0 to -8, it could get cold in a big hurry. There's a guy named John Parmentola, the CO2 Coalition, that actually has studied this and has written a lot of papers on it. And he says, I asked him, when's the Holocene going to end? He said, well, very soon. I said, well, what do you mean very soon? Well, he said within 500 years. So anyway, don't get too over worried, but there is that possibility, from the geologic standpoint that we're going to get cold in a hurry. And that's when people try to kill fossil fuels, that's something that they need to be thinking about. We may need those fossil fuels. So anyway, the 100,000 years duration, interglacial 10 years. This is the Holocene period. We were at a Holocene optimum. You hear constantly, we're at the highest temperature ever. Well, what do you mean ever? Come on now. Well, what they mean is in the instrumental record, which is 150 years. So, that's disingenuous to say we're at the highest temperature ever. We're not at the highest temperature ever. This is the killer chart. If I had one chart to show you in all my study, this is it. What this shows is that the temperature has been rising, and the blue line is fossil fuel usage. And fossil fuel usage accelerated after World War II. Now, how can an effect precede a cause? If you say the temperature rise is an effect caused by CO2, how can that precede by 150 years? Why, is the temperature smart and it knows that we're going to start using fossil fuels after World War II? It's ridiculous. Man, it's hard to see this thing. Okay, so is the warming anthropogenic, human caused? There's very little historic correlation between CO2 and temperature, and the temperatures have always preceded CO2. Patrick mentioned it's been 500 to 600 years in a lot of the cycles. The Earth has warmed over the last 150 years through recovery of the Little Ice Age. You may have heard of this thing called the Little Ice Age. You have cold periods, and we were at a cold period. Their natural cycles, together with some anthropogenic CO2, have warmed the Earth. Nobody's denying that CO2 has some effect, but it's basically mild. So there's a scientist in Australia, Jo Nova, who I really like. Go on her stream. She's come up with this picture. It says the evidence of warming. Yeah, there's a lot of evidence of warming. Is it anthropogenic? Some of it is, but it's little. It's overdone. What causes those 100,000-year cycles, the interglacials and the like? Well, there's something called the Milankovitch cycles, and what this does, it looks at the solar radiation with the orientation of the Earth. You have the elliptical orbit of the Earth and some called eccentricity, how egg-shaped the orbit is, that's one cause. The Earth, the axis goes 23.5 degrees normally, and it will go back and forth about 1 degree, which causes solar radiation on the northern hemisphere to vary. And then you have the Earth, the axis, it sort of wobbles like a top. You've seen a top, how the axis wobbles. Well, those three things have been actually attributed to climate influence. So these are natural climate influences. Their period is 100,000, 41,000, 27,000 years, the Milankovitch cycles. But there are also a lot of other cycles. Sunspot cycles, 11 years. Low sunspot activity in the past have correlated to colder temperatures. And by the way, we're about to get into a low sunspot activity cycle 25. And there are 10 other cycles. The ENSO, the Southern Oscillation that causes the El Niños, the La Niñas, et cetera, et cetera. People say that these Milankovitch cycles are too long. Yes, but if you look at it, there are like 10 other cycles, terrestrial, cosmological, oceanic. These cycles affect climate, especially the El Niños, okay, if you really study these things. Okay, so there's a narrative, the climate change narrative. Everybody's heard it. The primary driver of global climate is the emission of greenhouse gases, CO2, caused by the burning of fossil fuels. The corollary to that is the extreme weather hypothesis. Okay, climate change has caused hurricanes, less hurricanes, more intense hurricanes, forest fire, the extreme weather. So what happens is that every weather event, we've had hurricanes. The worst hurricane year, I think, was 1794 or something like that. I mean, that's the most intense and most hurricanes. Weather happens, and weather is not constant. Anybody believes that if CO2 is stable, you'll have stable weather, has not looked at anything. The other one, there's an assumption, climate stasis, which we're talking about. Without man's intervention in the climate, the Earth's climate will continue to be stable. I call this weather amnesia. You see this all the time. You get any storm, any weather event, it's climate change. Everything is climate change. Assumption number 2, the ideal climate assumption, that if we just quit messing around, the climate will be perfect. It is perfect now, and it will continue to be perfect forever. It's only man that's causing the climate change, and it's only man that's causing weather. And this is not very rational. Okay, does consensus science exist? I hear this all the time. They say 97% of scientists The smart scientists, anyway, agree that climate change, this is trying to marginalize the so-called deniers. Well, this is not true. You go back to these studies, the John Cook from Australia, and what you find is these things, the way they ask the questions, the way they formulate the results, the 97% number is baloney. It's pure baloney. That's the technical term. But I've gotten to where I originally would read all this stuff, but any article or anybody that says 97%, I immediately throw it in the trash because you can tell it's just propaganda. In a scientific method, in any event, consensus is irrelevant. You don't vote on good science. Consensus is a political term. Galileo said in The Question of Science, the authority of 1,000 is not worth the humble reasoning of a single individual. So I tend to believe Galileo. Okay, so my conclusion after 6 years of study is climate change is politics, not science. That's one word per year of study, and that's my conclusion. The term climate change is a narrative, not a scientific theory, a hypothesis. You have to be able to invalidate it, or it's not science. It's faith or belief system. So over the fact over the 4.68 billion years of the Earth's history, the climate has changed a lot. If you don't believe that, you haven't studied geology, you haven't studied science. Is there a case for alarmism? The UN's IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, wants maximum increase of 2 degrees. They say 1.5, as Patrick mentioned. Are we really to believe if the temperature goes up another ½ degree since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we're going to all burn? I sort of doubt it. You saw geologically between the coldest and the warmest periods, like a 9 to 10 degree thing. People lived in the bottom of the last age before the Holocene. These goals are completely arbitrary, the 1 to 2 degrees. And we talked about it's already warmed 1 degree. And the last 100 years includes natural climate change in addition to a small amount of anthropogenic warming. The recovery from the Little Ice Age is what it is. The only case for alarmism is models. If you look at the models versus reality, this is John Christie, University of Alabama, Huntsville. The two ones on the bottom are the balloons. The blue dots and the green things are balloons, which correspond to and agree pretty well with satellites. Satellites have been going since 1979. Remember, I said the modern history for temperature measurements, the instrumental temperature record is about 160 years. But since 1979, they've been able to get good coverage of the Earth and good thing. And the models, if you look at the models are way up. They overpredict warming by 2 or 3 times. And the other thing about models is they all predict mid-latitude warming or a tropical hotspot that is not observed in physical reality. The balloons don't observe this hotspot. So that's one of the reasons the models are wrong. There is massive amounts of money spent on these models. This is something that Patrick showed also. This is University of Alabama, Huntsville, where you have a pretty flat temperature in the last 30 years, which normally defines a record. So I actually had a later data point. I had February data point. How do you like that? And it shows almost no change from the 30-year average. Steve, El Nino, I mentioned El Ninos were one of the things that were correlated with warming. For instance, the big El Nino in 1998 and the like. And you'll get these other cycles. Let's move on. Steve Malloy recently came out with a blog, and the last 8 years we've had what's called the pause. There has been no measurable warming. Been only natural variability, and you can see it's flat. So anyway, Steve Malloy came out with this. This is NOAA data, and he got like 500,000 hits on his blog. So they say hey, the world's burning up. Well, why isn't the temperature going up? I mean, okay. This is part of the big thing. I have 12 minutes left, so I'll be expeditious here. The installation of wind and solar power. These are my lessons from looking at Uri and Elliott. They're not a direct replacement of dispatchable power. You hear, well, we're going to shut down a coal plant and put in a bunch of windmills. Well, it doesn't work that way because windmills are intermittent, they're dilute. Coal, gas, and nuclear are dispatchable. In Europe, you don't see this in the press, but if you look at Germany and if you look at the UK, power prices have just gone through the roof. UK has shut down coal, Germany's put in a lot of wind. Every country that you see the percentage of renewables goes up, there is a direct correlation. And this is not one of his shark correlations, this is a real correlation. You've got more renewables, it gets more expensive. And you may have sharks too, I don't know. Okay, wind power variability. Okay, this is what we studied. If you look at these three curves, this is a 24-hour variability of wind. This is 3 days in, I think it's the month of August in, was it 2020? And you can see wind picks up and blowing and going, and late at night you can see 15 gigawatts of ERCOT reported power going down to midday 5, back up to 15. There's another day where you start with 5 and you end up with 0. So over a 24-hour period, wind is extremely variable. You cannot store electricity. You have to make it and use it at the same time. That's what makes it so difficult. And the other thing about wind that people don't realize is the power you get out of wind is a function of the cube of the velocity. So if wind is doing like that, what does the cube of the velocity do? You know, wind is the power is very sensitive. So you have 24-hour variability, and this is seasonal variability, blowing and going. I think somebody said yesterday that wind was like 46% of ERCOT power. Well, that's fine. In March, as you can see there, in the springtime you get a lot of wind, but when you hit the doldrums late in the year, you got if you go from 13 miles per hour down to 8, that's about half, so you get about 25% of the power that the wind can provide. And here's the problem, wind droughts. Anybody heard of wind droughts? They're associated with high pressure systems, very stable high pressure systems that are both in the summer and the winter time. Uri, there was a 5-day wind drought. Germany saw wind drought in 2022. It was about 2 weeks. UK saw one in 2021 or 2021. So wind droughts happen, and you got to have backup power. Now, this is a very interesting graph from ERCOT. This is showing the power for megawatts for wind on typical days. And how would you like to be in the ERCOT control center controlling the balance of the grid with this level of variability? They don't have an easy job. They did I think an admirable job under the circumstances during Uri, but this is what they're up against. And those droughts I talked about. Here's examples of a few-day droughts that happened during 2021. So they happen. And what happens during drought? This is power during Elliott, which we just had. And you can see the green line. If this thing worked, I could actually. Okay, I can't show. But you can see the green line is wind. And as the front comes through, the wind dies down, you get the high pressure, the wind dies. Now, what has to happen? Well, you got to have gas compensating. We had gas, we had dispatchable power, and Elliott wasn't as strong of a winter storm as Uri was. Uri was an all-time record. But this is what has to happen. You have to have dispatchable gas. This is the German wind drought we talked about. The dark blue is offshore. The light blue is onshore energy. The yellow is solar, and the wiggly line at the top is the net power requirement to keep the grid stable. Now, normally on average, they're at this 24 gigawatt. They have 60 gigawatts of wind capacity in Germany. Normally they average about 24, so it's a factor like 40%. But during this 2-week period, you had 3 gigawatts. Now, are you going to use batteries? Grid scale batteries are typically 1 to 2 hours. Now, how's that going to help when you have 2 weeks of the wind not doing its thing? Texas is at roughly 35 gigawatts of wind availability, the power nominal capacity of wind. And you lose wind, and you got problems. That's 35 out of about 110 gigawatts total. So Texas leads the nation in wind, by the way. So here's what's happening. to our Texas grid. In 2008, we had essentially everything was dispatchable. We had coal, gas, and nuclear. And you can see as we've had the federal incentives, the wind and the solar have come up. So when you have higher weather-dependent power, you're going to have a higher level of instability. And that's where we're headed by 2026. What is the breaking point? I tend to think maybe it was Uri, but we're headed past Uri. Okay, so this is the wind power during Uri. Now this is a big point here. You can see in these areas, these are MISO, SNPP, and ERCOT. The wind died in the entire central United States, period. Why did we have problems and why did they not have problems in MISO and SNPP? Well, here's the answer. We didn't have as much coal power as SNPP and MISO. Dispatchable power, you got to have it. You cannot rely on wind energy and to deliver when you have a problem. And so this is the problem. We have 14 gigawatts of wind energy, not enough. And these other groups are going to shut down. Okay, I got 5 minutes left, and we're going to go through policy a little bit. Let's pretend that the weather control knob is CO2. Well, what are people doing about CO2? Well, this is a graph showing the anthropogenic CO2 emissions by country and on a global basis. So you can see in the United States about 5 to 6 gigatons per year, and it's coming down. Why? Natural gas, okay? That's why it's coming down, replacing coal. Here's Germany. They spent $1 trillion, and look at where they are. Now here's China. There's Germany. There's China. You see China's 11 gigatons a year, and they're increasing. So is India. So they have not bought into the Paris Agreement. They believe that they need dispatchable energy, cheap energy, to make their populations flourish. And together, these are about half of the world's CO2. But you can look at the trend. There's China. There's that. So this is now, what if you did a COVID-type restriction and you really shut down the economy? Well, what you can see at the very top of the graph, you can see COVID took a little bump. All the stuff that we had to do for COVID, shutting down the economy, took a little bump. But there's where we back up in 2022. So you're not going to shut down the U.S. industry. You're not going to do a lot. I mean, this is inevitable. This is what's happening with CO2. We cannot destroy the Texas economy and the U.S. economy, save the planet by reducing CO2. Okay, coal power. If you look at coal power, these are gigawatts. You got China on the left. You have roughly 1,074 gigawatts, about half the global total. They've shut down 100 plants. They're converting their plants to new technology, putting in scrubbers, electric precipitators, and cleaning up their environment, which is good. There's India second. They're also adding a little bit. They're not part of the Paris Agreement, and good for them. They're helping their population out. Now here we are, roughly 220 gigawatts of coal power, and what are we doing? It's under attack. Okay, so in the U.S. We have a program of shutting down coal, and basically. The rest of the world is also increasing coal in total. So our Secretary of Energy, there she is, Jennifer Grantham, she's right. What she says is, and I cannot read this, but basically we need to be doing what China's doing. I agree with her. I think we ought to be saving our coal, maybe even putting in a little bit more. And here's our friends in the Texas Public Policy Foundation, a really good guy, Chuck DeVore, and says, well, China's trying to fool Western nations into thinking that we're China's actually doing something climate. They're wordsmithing and pretending compared to what we're doing, okay? The Biden administration strategy is to tighten regulations. Cost-benefit analysis was actually outlawed. by executive order, and the EPA is supposed to represent the best interest of everybody. But it's actually, the EPA is being used, it seems to me, it's sort of a tool for the progressive climate policies. And it's not surprising. They have a revolving door. For instance, Gina McCarthy, the head of the EPA under Obama, went to the National Resource Defense Council in the Trump years, hid out there for a while. Now she's back under Biden. So Congress has mandated cost-benefit analysis. Every regulation is supposed to have cost-benefit analysis. But if you look at these things, they're sort of, are you really telling me you're balanced on your analysis? No, the analysis, I think, is slanted toward shutting down coal. So the Green New Deal, what is the Green New Deal? Well, they quit calling the Inflation Reduction Act the Inflation Reduction Act. In Washington now, it's the new Green Deal revised, which is actually what it is. 360-some billion, 369 billion. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Act also threw fuel on that fire. And they re-entered the Paris Agreement. And remember, China and India are not part of the Paris Agreement. But what they do when they re-entered the Paris Agreement? Well, one of the things they did is they doubled the reduction versus the 2005 base from what Obama had originally proposed, from 1.6 to 3 gigatons per year. Now, remember, we said the U.S. is 5 to 6 gigatons a year. So a reduction of 3 gigatons a year versus 1.5 gigatons a year, that is a heck of an increase in the reduction target. So the new target is a 50 to 52% reduction versus 28% prior. The only way to achieve that, you can do the math, is to shut down coal. Remember, we said coal is what saved us in some effect during the winter storms. You've got to have that dispatchable power. The key regulatory initiatives by the Biden, they are absolutely, that administration's conducting war on fossil fuels, as Wayne Christian told us. There's all sorts of rules that they've promulgated this year. The cross-state air pollution rule, for the first time, if their models show we waft up a couple parts per billion of ozone up to Wisconsin and the like, then maybe they've shut down plants. The soot, they've changed the soot regulations from 12 to 8 milligrams per liter. And so anyway, all these rules, this is what's happening, is we're being run through these rules. The soot PM 2.5 rule, Steve Malloy has a very good website on that, but that's what's happening. So thank you for your attention. I think I ran 1 minute over, which is the least I've ever run over in my entire life. So you guys need to be appreciative for that.
Thank you, Greg. Appreciate it very much. One item I didn't mention to everyone that I'll just mention before we do a little presentation of a charitable award from the conference is everybody will see on this their table this little flyer. And at this International Conference on Climate that was held just 3 weeks ago, there was a book put out with 30 prominent climate topics for teachers and students. It's a real nice little book. And they've allowed us to download as many free copies as we wish. So there's a little QRL code on the bottom of this, and you can use that either on your mobile device or your computer and download this booklet. It's very nice, and it's just full of great topics and actual facts on climate that you're not generally going to hear. So that's available to everybody, and you can distribute it to friends. As many people who want to download it are welcome to do so. So with that, I'll call Ben up here, and I think we have a little award. And thanks to Greg. Let's give Greg one more round of applause.
Appreciate all you guys joining us today. Justin Brown, Lori Simpson, if y'all could join me up here real quick. So continuing in our tradition we started a few years ago where we've given back to the community, and that's largely on behalf of our sponsors and each and every one of our guests that join us here today. Y'all have all contributed to this in some way. We kind of started thinking back as a subcommittee of ways that we could give back and all the amazing things that goes on here in East Texas and charities and contributions. And we also started thinking about some of our subcommittee members that have been with us since the infancy of this. And there's one particular one that came to mind, and he's been so impactful, not only on this year's summit, but the entire 12 years before that, was Ernie LaFleur. And Ernie is also not only a part of this, but he's also very active in the community, and he's a part of the White House Parks and Recreation Board, along with Lori Simpson and Justin Brown. Many of y'all probably visited their store down on Highway 110. Simpson's sells the bikes, the kayaks, and all that. Well, the White House Parks and Rec has put together a trail in White House, and I'm going to let Justin here in just a minute talk a little bit more about this, but Black Hawk Trail that they've started a few years ago. I know we got a few cyclists in the room, Adam Glover, Billy Hibbs, a few others that have probably spent some time down there on this trail, either riding or hiking it and enjoying it. But this trail is much more than just White House. It's for the entire community of East Texas. And so today we've put together a check that we're going to donate to Ernie, Justin, Lori, and to the entire Parks and Recs down there at White House to continue the growth of that trail. So we've got a $2,500 check here to present to you guys to continue the growth of that trail. And Justin, if you've got just a minute or two, could you tell us a little bit about the trail and what's going on down there?
Sure, yeah. Hey guys, how are y'all? Y'all doing all right today? Y'all look good. So Black Hawk Creek is just a small trail out by a water treatment plant in White House, kind of at a dead end of a neighborhood, if you want to say. But it's around 2 miles long right now. With this, we can kind of expand that. We're going to look to try to go to at least a 5 or a 6 mile trail. It ends up being pretty cool for the residents that are local. We have a lot of traffic on that 2 miles. It's kind of neat to see a lot of the community come out and show support for it. We've got tons of volunteers that have put in man hours. We've gotten a ton of volunteers to donate. This is all pretty much donations that have kind of made this happen. But we would love for you guys to come out and check out Black Hawk Creek. If you don't know where it's at, you can look it up on Google. It's on there. So other than that, we thank you guys for doing this. Ben, Ernie, thank you for being a part of this. We really appreciate that. It's going to help in more than many ways. So if you need any cycling things, come down to Simpson's.
And with that, Claude, would you come up and wrap us up? Thank you, guys.
How about another round of applause for the presenters? It has definitely been an informative session, and I appreciate everyone joining us today. I'd like to remind you that the Chamber website will have a link to where you can go back and watch a rebroadcast of today's program. And again, a heartfelt thanks to our sponsors. We appreciate you all very much and your support, and we appreciate you just helping us put everything together and making all this come together possible. Again, thank you to our Energy Committee, Subcommittee over the Energy Summit. I often say that it's like I wake up and all these things happen. And this little Christmas elves like Gates and Ernie that make it happen, Ben. Y'all are great, and I appreciate y'all very much. And a round of applause to these gentlemen, please. Lastly, I'd like to thank Commissioner Christian. Please keep that enthusiasm and that no-nonsense approach. And we appreciate you, sir, in looking out for our industry, looking out for really the betterment of our community society. And we appreciate you very much, sir. Now we consider ourselves adjourned. Have a good day.